Don't move. One more step and I swear I'll drop you where you stand. The officer's voice cut through the early morning air like a blade, sharp and absolute, echoing off the parked cars lining the quiet Chicago street. Ryan Mitchell stood with his service weapon raised, feet planted wide on the asphalt, eyes locked on the woman in front of him as if the entire world had narrowed down to that single moment of perceived threat. Ava Johnson didn't flinch. The wind brushed lightly against the edge of her black blazer, carrying the faint sound of distant traffic and a passing train somewhere beyond the city blocks. Her posture remained steady, controlled, almost unnervingly calm, as though the tension in the air belonged to someone else's reality. Ryan's partner hovered a few steps behind, hand already near his radio, watching the scene unfold with the uneasy stillness of someone who knew things were about to escalate but couldn't yet see how. You picked the wrong place, Ryan continued, his tone carrying a mix of frustration and certainty, the kind built from years of assuming every situation could be read in seconds. Ava's gaze shifted slightly, not to the weapon, not to the officer, but to the badge clipped to her own coat, partially concealed beneath the fabric. You don't understand what you're stepping into, she said quietly, her voice even, measured, carrying no panic, only fact. A nearby resident pulled back a curtain from a second-floor window, sensing movement on the street below, while another passerby slowed their steps, unsure whether to continue walking or turn away. Ryan gave a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head as if he had heard this kind of excuse too many times before. I understand just fine, he replied. People don't just walk into a situation like this and tell me how it's going to go. The space between them tightened, not physically, but in the way silence began to weigh heavier than sound. Ava slowly reached into her inner pocket, her movements deliberate, unhurried, making sure every action was visible, readable, intentional. Ryan's grip tightened instinctively, his focus narrowing as his training dictated, but something in the rhythm of her calm began to disrupt the certainty he had carried moments earlier. She didn't speak again, not yet, but her eyes lifted to meet his fully now, steady and unshaken, carrying a depth of composure that didn't match the assumption he had already made about her. The morning light shifted across the street, reflecting off windshields and glass, turning the entire block into a quiet stage where every breath felt amplified. For the first time since he arrived, Ryan hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, long enough for doubt to enter where confidence had been. Ryan Mitchell held his position on the quiet Chicago street, the early morning light growing brighter as more details of the scene became visible, sharpening edges of cars, sidewalks, and faces that had begun to gather at a cautious distance. His breathing was steady, but the confidence he carried moments earlier now felt slightly heavier, as if the situation was no longer as simple as it first appeared. Ava Johnson remained still, her posture unchanged, her eyes never locked on the obvious source of tension but instead scanning the environment with a calm precision that did not match the expectations Ryan had formed about her. His partner shifted uneasily behind him, glancing between Ryan and the woman, then briefly toward the growing number of bystanders who had slowed to observe what was unfolding. Ava finally moved her hand again, slowly, deliberately, retrieving something from inside her jacket, and every small motion felt amplified in the silence. Ryan tracked the movement instantly, his focus narrowing as training took over, but there was still something about her behavior that did not align with the reactions he was used to seeing in similar situations. She did not rush, did not plead, did not escalate her voice, instead maintaining a steady composure that felt almost out of place in the charged atmosphere. When she pulled out a small leather holder, she paused just long enough for the moment to stretch, then opened it halfway so that only a partial glimpse of identification was visible from where Ryan stood. Before this goes any further, she said calmly, her voice carrying. Clearly without effort, you should verify what you are looking at. Ryan frowned slightly, tightening his jaw, unwilling to shift his assumptions too quickly. He had seen identification cards before, had dealt with claims that fell apart under scrutiny, and his experience told him not to trust appearances under pressure. Still, something about the way she presented it did not feel performative or defensive, it felt procedural, almost like she expected compliance rather than confrontation. A nearby observer whispered something under their breath, but the words were lost in the stillness that had settled over the street. Ryan's partner leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as he spoke, suggesting they confirm through dispatch, a standard step that now seemed more urgent than before. Ava did not interrupt, did not press, she simply waited, holding the open credential holder steady in her hand. The wind moved again through the street, lifting loose paper near the curb, and for a brief moment the entire scene felt suspended, as if the world itself was waiting for confirmation before deciding what it was witnessing. Ryan's expression tightened as he glanced briefly toward his radio, then back at Ava, and for the first time his certainty began to fracture into something more cautious, something less absolute. He exhaled slowly, lowering his voice slightly as he gave the instruction to verify her identity, while Ava continued to stand in the same calm position, her presence unchanged, her silence now carrying more weight than anything that had been said so far. The moment stretched in a way that made the entire street feel quieter than it should have been, as Ryan Mitchell stood with his attention divided between the woman in front of him and the radio in his hand, waiting for confirmation that could either validate or completely overturn everything he believed he understood about the situation. Ava Johnson remained in the same position, her arm steady, the identification still partially visible but not forced forward, as if she had no need to convince anyone beyond what procedure would naturally reveal. Around them, the early morning city continued to move in. Fragments, distant engines passing, a bus slowing at the corner, and pedestrians hesitating just long enough to sense that something unusual was unfolding before choosing to keep their distance. Ryan's partner spoke quietly into the radio, providing details with controlled urgency, while Ryan kept his eyes fixed on Ava, searching for any shift in behavior that might indicate deception or pressure, yet finding none. Instead, there was only stillness, the kind that did not feel passive but intentional, as though she was allowing the situation to resolve itself without interference. A few seconds later, Ryan's radio crackled with static, followed by a brief exchange of confirmation codes that made his posture subtly change. He did not speak immediately, absorbing what he was hearing, his expression tightening as the information being relayed did not match the assumptions that had guided his response moments earlier. Ava noticed the change, but she did not react outwardly, only lowering her hand slightly as if she already knew the direction things were about to take. Ryan's partner glanced at him, waiting for instruction, uncertainty now replacing the earlier confidence that had filled the space between them. Ryan exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and lowered his weapon a fraction, not fully, but enough to signal that the situation was no longer being treated the same way it had been at the start. The radio transmission continued, confirming identity, authorization level, and federal oversight, each detail adding weight to the reality that was now forming in front of him. Ryan's eyes flicked back to Ava, and for the first time he seemed to study her not as a suspect in a misjudged encounter, but as someone whose presence carried authority he had not recognized. The bystanders who had gathered began to sense the shift as well, their posture changing, some lowering their phones slightly, others stepping back as the tension transitioned from confrontation to reassessment. Ava finally spoke again, her voice still calm, but now carrying a quiet certainty that matched the confirmation unfolding through the radio. "You have your answer," she said simply, without emphasis or pride, just fact. Ryan did not respond immediately, his jaw tightening as he processed not only the confirmation itself but the speed at which his initial judgment had formed and begun to collapse. His partner turned slightly toward him, waiting for direction, while Ryan slowly adjusted his stance, the weight of the moment settling into something more internal than visible. The street remained still, but the energy had shifted completely, as if the rules of the situation had quietly rewritten themselves without ceremony, leaving only the consequence of what had been assumed too quickly and what was now undeniably real. For a moment after the confirmation came through the radio, the street did not move, as if time itself had paused to allow the meaning of what had just been verified to fully settle into every person standing there. Ryan Mitchell kept his position, but the tension in his shoulders shifted, no longer directed outward in confrontation but inward in processing what the official response had just made clear. Ava Johnson lowered her identification holder completely now, not because she needed to prove anything further, but because the system around her had already done so. The air felt different, less compressed, though still heavy with the aftermath of misunderstanding. Ryan's partner stepped slightly closer to him, speaking in a low tone that suggested caution rather than urgency, as if the situation had moved from control to correction. Ryan did not answer immediately. His eyes remained on Ava, but the sharp certainty that had defined his earlier stance had softened into something more uncertain, more reflective. The bystanders who had gathered along the sidewalk were no longer whispering in curiosity, but instead watching in silence, sensing the shift in authority that had quietly taken place without a single raised voice. Ava finally took a small step forward, not toward Ryan in aggression or challenge, but simply to close the distance enough for clarity. Her expression remained composed, her presence steady, but there was now a subtle weight behind her calm that made it clear she had moved through this kind of misunderstanding before. "This is no longer about what you thought," she said evenly, her voice carrying just enough to reach both officers without effort. Ryan's jaw tightened slightly, not in defiance this time, but in acknowledgement of the truth behind her words. He lowered his gaze briefly, as if recalibrating the entire sequence of events that had led them to this point, each assumption now exposed under the weight of verified information. His partner glanced toward the radio again, then back at Ava, as though still waiting for further instruction from a system that had already spoken clearly. Ava's focus remained steady, not on blame, but on resolution, as if the purpose of her presence had never been confrontation, only confirmation. A passing vehicle slowed at the intersection, its driver looking toward the scene before continuing on, while the city around them resumed its rhythm in small fragments, unaffected but observant. Ryan finally exhaled and lowered his voice, giving a brief instruction to his partner that signaled the transition from escalation to protocol correction. There was no resistance, no argument, only the quiet recognition that the situation had already resolved itself through channels beyond personal judgment. Ava adjusted her coat slightly, preparing to continue her original purpose for being there, her movements unhurried and precise. Ryan stepped aside just enough to clear her path, his posture no longer rigid but restrained, as if still processing the weight of what had been learned in such a short span of time. The distance between them remained, but the meaning of that distance had changed completely, no longer defined by threat or suspicion, but by the consequences of assumption meeting undeniable reality. The silence that followed the shift in authority lingered in a way that felt heavier than the initial confrontation, as if the street itself was absorbing the consequences of how quickly perception had been rewritten. Ryan Mitchell stood slightly apart now, no longer blocking the woman in front of him, his posture restrained in a way that reflected internal recalibration rather than external command. Ava Johnson continued forward with measured steps, moving past the point where tension had peaked and into a space where procedure and reality were now aligned. Her expression remained unchanged, calm and deliberate, as though moments like these were not exceptions but familiar outcomes of a system she understood more deeply than those around her. Ryan's partner shifted closer to him, speaking quietly in a tone that suggested caution in both action and judgment, while Ryan only nodded once without fully turning his gaze away from Ava. The bystanders who had gathered began to disperse slowly, their curiosity replaced by the quiet realization that the moment they had anticipated as conflict had resolved into something more administrative and less dramatic than expected, yet far more impactful for those directly involved. Ava stopped briefly near the edge of the sidewalk, adjusting the sleeve of her jacket with a small controlled motion, then glanced toward Ryan for the first time since the confirmation had been received. There was no anger in her expression, no satisfaction, only a neutral clarity that suggested the situation had never required emotional escalation. "You followed protocol once the facts were clear," she said evenly, her voice neither soft nor firm, simply precise. Ryan gave a slight nod, acknowledging the truth of that statement, though it carried a weight that extended beyond procedure. He understood now that his initial response had been shaped not by evidence, but by assumption, and that recognition settled into his posture in a way that could not be immediately undone. Ava turned slightly, preparing to continue her original path, but paused as Ryan spoke for the first time since the shift in confirmation, his voice lower than before, stripped of earlier certainty. "I misread the situation," he said simply, without justification or defense. Ava looked at him briefly, not with judgment, but with the kind of measured awareness that came from experience rather than emotion. "It happens quickly when assumptions lead," she replied, then continued walking without altering her pace. Ryan watched her for a moment as she moved further down the street, the space between them widening not with tension, but with separation of roles that had been clarified too late to matter for prevention but in time to restore order. His partner exhaled slowly beside him, glancing toward the radio one final time before lowering it fully, signaling that the incident had officially transitioned into closure. The street gradually returned to its normal rhythm, pedestrians resuming movement, vehicles continuing through intersections, and the morning light spreading evenly across surfaces that had moments earlier felt compressed by uncertainty. Ryan remained still for a few seconds longer, processing not the outcome itself, but the speed at which certainty had collapsed under verified truth. Then, with a quiet adjustment of his stance, he turned slightly toward his partner, signaling readiness to continue patrol, though something in his expression suggested the experience would remain longer than the incident itself. The street had fully returned to its ordinary rhythm, but the echo of what had just occurred still lingered in subtle ways that could not be immediately erased, as if the environment itself remembered the brief moment when certainty had collapsed into verification. Ryan Mitchell walked a few steps with his partner before slowing his pace, his eyes briefly scanning the sidewalk where Ava Johnson had disappeared from view. The conversation between them remained minimal, consisting mostly of procedural acknowledgements, yet Ryan's silence carried more weight than anything spoken. His partner glanced at him once or twice, recognizing the difference in his demeanor compared to the beginning of the call, when confidence had been absolute and unchallenged. Now there was restraint, not hesitation in duty, but reflection in judgment. A few blocks away, Ava continued walking with steady control, her movements unhurried as she merged into the flow of early city activity. She checked her watch briefly, noting the time with quiet precision, then adjusted her path toward a parked vehicle positioned along a less crowded section of the street. The identification case remained secured inside her jacket, no longer necessary to display, yet still present as a reminder of how quickly perception could shift when information replaced assumption. She paused near the vehicle, glancing once across the street where the interaction had taken place, not to revisit the event emotionally, but to confirm its closure in practical terms. Meanwhile, Ryan stopped near the corner, turning slightly as if reconsidering the sequence of events from start to finish. The radio on his shoulder remained quiet now, the earlier confirmation already logged into official channels, leaving only the aftermath in his immediate awareness. His partner spoke softly, suggesting they move on to the next assignment, but Ryan did not respond right away. Instead, he looked back toward the street, where pedestrians now moved without interruption, unaware of the internal recalibration that had taken place moments earlier. Ava opened the vehicle door and paused briefly before entering, her attention momentarily shifting to the city beyond the windshield. There was no sign of urgency in her movements, only completion, as though the purpose of her presence had been fulfilled without excess or disturbance. Ryan finally turned away from the intersection, adjusting his posture and preparing to continue patrol, though the experience remained present in his thoughts in a way that did not interfere with procedure but subtly influenced perspective. His partner walked beside him, speaking briefly about routine matters, but Ryan's attention remained divided between the present and the realization that perception, once formed, could change direction in an instant when confronted with verified truth. The street behind them carried on unchanged, yet for those who had been part of the moment, something had quietly shifted in understanding, leaving behind a reminder that certainty without confirmation could always be temporary. Ryan Mitchell and his partner continued moving through the early morning streets, the city gradually returning to its normal rhythm as traffic increased and pedestrians filled the sidewalks with the quiet urgency of routine. The incident that had taken place only minutes earlier was now officially closed in procedural terms, yet its presence remained embedded in Ryan's thoughts in a way that did not interfere with his duties but subtly reshaped how he processed what he saw around him. His partner spoke occasionally about upcoming patrol routes and scheduled checks, maintaining a steady professional tone, but Ryan responded with shorter acknowledgements than usual, his attention divided between the present environment and the internal reflection that had begun forming earlier. Behind them, the intersection where the encounter had occurred looked unchanged, as if nothing unusual had happened there at all, yet Ryan knew that what had taken place was not measured by external signs but by the internal shift it created in understanding. Ava Johnson sat inside the unmarked vehicle a few blocks away, the engine idling softly as she reviewed a small digital device in her hand, scanning brief lines of information related to her assignment. Her expression remained composed, her focus directed toward completion rather than reflection, as though the event she had just passed through was one of many points in a longer sequence rather than a singular defining moment. She briefly glanced out the window, observing the street where movement continued uninterrupted, then set the device aside and adjusted her posture as if preparing to transition fully back into operational focus. Ryan slowed briefly near a crosswalk, his eyes scanning the distance without urgency, and for a moment he replayed the sequence of events from the initial stop to the final confirmation. What stood out was not the correction itself, but the speed at which assumption had formed before information had been verified. His partner noticed the quietness and lightly broke the silence with a comment about the next location, prompting Ryan to nod and shift his attention forward again. As they resumed walking, Ryan's posture remained steady, but his internal processing continued, no longer centered on the outcome but on the structure of judgment that had led there. Ava started the vehicle and slowly merged into traffic, her movement smooth and controlled, blending into the flow of the city without drawing attention. The morning light reflected across building surfaces and windshields, creating brief flashes of brightness that faded as quickly as they appeared, mirroring the way the earlier tension had resolved into normalcy. Ryan and his partner continued down the sidewalk, now fully transitioning back into routine patrol activity, yet the experience remained present in Ryan's awareness as a quiet reference point, a reminder that certainty without verification could shift in an instant when confronted with truth already established beyond perception. The city had fully settled into its daytime rhythm, with steady traffic moving through intersections and pedestrians filling the sidewalks in a pattern of ordinary motion that gave no indication of the events that had taken place earlier. Ryan Mitchell and his partner continued their patrol route, now several blocks away from the initial location, maintaining professional focus while the radio transmitted routine updates in the background. Ryan's posture remained controlled, his movements consistent with standard procedure, yet his internal attention was still anchored to the earlier encounter in a way that surfaced quietly between moments of normal activity. His partner walked slightly ahead, checking directions on a handheld device before speaking briefly about a reported disturbance in another sector, but Ryan responded with minimal acknowledgement, his thoughts still processing the difference between assumption and verification. As they approached a busier intersection, Ryan slowed for a moment, allowing a group of pedestrians to pass, and his gaze drifted across the street where reflections of sunlight moved across glass windows and vehicle surfaces. There was nothing unusual in the environment now, nothing that suggested the earlier tension had ever existed, yet the memory of how quickly perception had formed and collapsed remained present in his awareness. He adjusted his position slightly, shifting his weight as he continued walking, and his partner glanced at him with a brief look of curiosity before returning focus to the route ahead. Neither of them spoke for several seconds, allowing the natural sound of the city to fill the space between them. Ryan eventually broke the silence with a short confirmation of their next checkpoint, his voice steady and professional, signaling a return to full operational engagement. However, even as he spoke, there was a subtle change in how he observed the environment, as though each interaction now carried an added layer of verification before acceptance. The patrol car assignment ahead required standard procedure checks, and Ryan acknowledged the update through the radio before continuing forward. Behind them, the earlier location of the incident remained distant and inactive, fully absorbed back into normal city movement. Ava Johnson, now several blocks away, continued her route without interruption, her presence integrated into the broader flow of activity, no longer defined by the brief confrontation but by the continuity of her assignment. Inside her vehicle, she reviewed a final set of details on her device, then closed it with deliberate precision, signaling completion of that phase of work. The city around her moved without pause, reflecting the steady pace of routine operations that continued regardless of individual moments of tension or clarity. Ryan and his partner turned onto a wider street, aligning with their next scheduled location, while Ryan maintained a steady forward gaze. The earlier experience remained with him, not as disruption, but as reference, quietly reinforcing the importance of confirmation over assumption in every judgment made going forward. The afternoon light had shifted slightly across the city, casting longer reflections along the glass buildings and turning the streets into a layered pattern of brightness and shadow as Ryan Mitchell and his partner continued their patrol route. The earlier assignment had been fully cleared from active response, leaving only routine operations ahead, yet Ryan's internal processing of the event remained steady and uninterrupted, like a background thread that continued running beneath normal function. His partner spoke occasionally about minor updates from dispatch, but Ryan responded with brief confirmations, his focus distributed between external awareness and internal reflection. They passed through a busier commercial district where foot traffic increased, and for a brief moment Ryan slowed his pace to allow a group of pedestrians to cross at the intersection. The movement of people, vehicles, and ambient city noise created a familiar rhythm, yet Ryan's perception of it now included an additional layer of observation shaped by what he had experienced earlier in the day. Across town, Ava Johnson had completed her immediate assignment and was now seated inside a quiet administrative facility, reviewing a final report on a secure terminal. Her posture remained composed, her attention steady as she scanned through structured data entries that documented the resolution of the earlier encounter. She paused briefly, not out of concern, but out of procedural review, then confirmed the final status update before closing the file. The action was simple, but final in its administrative meaning. She then stood, adjusted her jacket, and prepared to move to the next scheduled briefing, her expression unchanged and focused entirely on operational continuity. Meanwhile, Ryan and his partner arrived at a designated checkpoint near a transit hub, stepping out of their vehicle to complete a standard visibility patrol. The environment was active but controlled, with commuters moving through entrances and exits in steady flow. Ryan observed the area with measured attention, noting patterns of movement and potential points of interest, though nothing required intervention. His partner checked in with dispatch again, confirming all clear status for the previous location, and Ryan acknowledged the update with a slight nod. As they continued their walk along the perimeter of the station, Ryan's thoughts briefly returned to the earlier encounter, not as an emotional recollection, but as a structured evaluation of decision-making under uncertainty. The realization that verification had shifted the entire trajectory of the situation remained present, reinforcing a more deliberate approach in how he processed new interactions. The city around them continued without disruption, trains arriving and departing, announcements echoing through platforms, and people moving with purpose. Ava exited the facility a short time later, stepping into the daylight with steady pace, merging once again into the flow of professional movement that defined her assignment cycle. There was no remaining tension attached to the earlier moment, only completion and transition. Ryan and his partner finished their perimeter check and prepared to relocate, maintaining standard patrol rhythm. As they moved back toward their vehicle, Ryan's expression remained neutral, but his awareness carried a lasting adjustment, one shaped not by the outcome itself, but by the understanding that accuracy required confirmation before judgment, regardless of initial perception or confidence.